Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Schiff, CEO here at the Rhode Island Community Food Bank. Welcome to our speaker series. I would much prefer that we were all meeting in person this morning at the food bank. But it turns out there's an advantage to a virtual meeting, and that is that we can far exceed our room capacity, which is a really good thing because we've attracted a large audience for today's meeting of food bank supporters and colleagues and activists. Thank you all for joining us. If at any point during today's meeting you have a question, use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Click on that, type in your question, and we'll save time to answer all of your questions. For the many months now, all of us have been consumed by the pandemic and by the presidential election. We don't know how the pandemic is going to play out, but we finally know the outcome of the presidential election. And now it's an opportunity for us to reflect on what it means, and in particular, what it means for people facing food insecurity and hunger. And I can think of no better person to help us understand the impact of the election than Ellen Teller. Ellen is the Director of Government Affairs at FRAC, Food Research and Action Center in Washington, D.C. If you don't know about FRAC, FRAC is the leading nonprofit organization working to eradicate hunger in the United States. And FRAC does lots of wonderful things, but one of the things that we're most grateful to them for is they coordinate a network of advocates across the country to promote best practices and strengthen policies that reduce hunger. Ellen is a good friend, and she has traveled to Rhode Island in the past to meet with us here at the food bank. We're thrilled that she agreed to join us this morning. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you so much. And I too wish we were all together at the food bank, because I do recall a few years ago having a phenomenal breakfast made by your incredibly talented chefs, and begging them for a couple of recipes, which I have used back home. So maybe next year we will all be together and enjoying that wonderful breakfast. So thanks so much for inviting me up here to join you this morning. It's a pleasure. I was just saying to Andrew and to Lisa and others, it's been quite a week. It's a lot has happened, and I want to just give you a top line sort of picture of my thoughts of what the new landscape looks like. And I want to make sure that we save a lot of time for your questions and answers, because I really want to make sure that we get to those. So three things I want to just start out with about what I think the new administration and the new Congress need to focus on straight up. The first thing is that there have been a series of proposed rules coming out of USDA that weakened and eliminated benefits for millions of SNAP recipients and people who are eligible for SNAP. And so the first thing we want to do is make sure that day one, the Biden administration would suspend and rescind all of those proposed and final rules that would restrict benefits to people in need. You may have heard about the so-called able-bodied adults without dependent provision, which was a rule that was finalized. Congress suspended it, and the courts have placed an injunction on it. And it's pretty outrageous in the middle of a pandemic that has economic repercussions in every state in this country to terminate benefits for people who are searching for work but can't find it. The other rules have to do with what we call the heat need provision with people who are experiencing high utility costs, and then a provision called broad-based categorical eligibility, which allows mostly low-income families with children to more easily access SNAP benefits while still meeting all the SNAP criteria. So again, a lot of the barriers to participation, which advocates across the country for years have tried to break down, new barriers were erected in these three particular administrative rules that came out of the Trump administration. And we would like to see the Biden administration suspend those permanently. The second piece that I wanted to highlight, and this is something you've probably heard a lot through the advocacy of folks in Rhode Island and across the country, is the need for a SNAP benefit boost. Now, some of you may recall back in 2008, when the recession hit, one of the first pieces of legislation that Congress put out included an across-the-board benefit boost to all SNAP recipients. And what this did was not only decrease food insecurity across the country, improve health outcomes for families that had those additional resources, but economists all across the board said by immediately putting additional resources on the EBT cards, and people went into grocery stores and farmers markets and CSAs across the country and swiped those cards, it was an infusion of resources into local economies. And what Mark Zandi from Moody's Economy said, for every dollar that the federal government put into SNAP during this economic downturn in 2008, somewhere between $1.50 and $1.85 in economic activity was generated. And a lot of the grocery stores will tell you that, they had to hire more people to stock the shelves. They just saw down the food chain the repercussions of that benefit boost. And so what we've been advocating is for Congress to take up a benefit boost, boosting the maximum benefit, but also increasing the minimum benefit, which federally is at $16 now. So again, putting resources in the hands of families that have great need. And lastly, there have been some additional flexibilities granted by USDA to respond to the pandemic, most notably pandemic EBT. When it became apparent that schools were shuttering and children were going to be home and they weren't getting access to their school breakfast and lunch, Congress immediately passed legislation that provided a pandemic EBT card for families that normally received free and reduced price school meals, so that parents could go to grocery stores, farmers markets, CSAs, and purchase the food that would be necessary to make up for the loss that kids were experiencing. They also provided a lot of flexibilities to schools and community-based organizations that were also providing meals out to families in need. And by suspending all of those rules, we were able to see providers who normally are up and running during the summer. They were out there in droves, making sure families got meals provided to them. And it wasn't just come for one meal. You could pick up multiple meals and know you did not have to bring your child with you to pick up the meals, because we were in a health pandemic and we really did not want lots of people showing up at the bus stop to pick up the meals or at a summer food site. So we want to see those continued. And what's really important is in our advocacy, we keep saying that we don't necessarily want to see these flexibilities terminated at the end of the health pandemic. We want to see them terminated at the end of the economic impact of the pandemic. So when we talk about a SNAP boost, we want to see that tied to some economic indicator, maybe unemployment rates or something else, so that we know that families are back on their feet, and that's when we can ease those benefit boosts. So those are the three big areas. Now, I know that there's also been a lot of attention to the emergency food boxes that I know folks in Rhode Island received in the beginning and during the year and during the summer months. And initially, those were supposed to benefit local farms that were struggling and also provide much needed resources to families in need. And moving forward, if that program is continued, we'd like to make sure that it stays true to the original intent, that it definitely we see the procurement side coming from local farms. Now, moving into the new Congress, nobody knows whether or not during this lame duck period, we will see an emergency relief package. And that's what advocates are pushing for right now, because there is a tremendous need out there right now. And so we would like to see that benefit boost included in any lame duck package that moves. But we also know come January, the new administration is going to be looking at some rather large economic relief packages. You've heard the president-elect talk about climate change, infrastructure, criminal justice reform, economic enhancements. We see a role for the anti-hunger community in all of the above. And we want to definitely be at the table and make sure that our priorities are included in any large driver that is coming up through legislation. FRAC just released yesterday our priority piece. So if you go to frac.org, you will see it there, or you can access it through FRAC tweets or at my Twitter account at Ellen_Teller. So you will get the whole panoply of priorities that we are addressing. The other thing I wanted to mention is that every 4 to 5 years, Congress opens the books on either a farm bill or on a child nutrition reauthorization bill. Congress recently completed a farm bill, and what is up on deck right now is a child nutrition reauthorization bill. And what that bill will do is look at the laws that govern feeding programs in preschool settings through WIC and the Child and Adult Care Food Program, in school-based settings, school breakfast and lunch, and in out-of-school time settings. And that's through the summer meals program, after school, snacks and suppers. Now, because I've been up in Rhode Island a lot, I know that you guys rock in terms of summer meals. I've been to every inch of green space that you have in downtown Providence, and I know that your providers are doing quality programming and providing incredibly nutritionally rich meals during the summer months. But having talked to a lot of you and my FRAC colleagues doing the deep dive into summer meals, we know that there are a lot of administrative barriers that make the program difficult for providers and for families. So you could be a provider running an after-school program during the school year, and then once school closes, you have to start an entirely different program for the summer months. We'd like to see that wall knocked down and a seamless year-round, 365 days a year program that takes care of feeding kids during weekends and holidays and snow days and anything we can imagine. coming up that would prevent kids from going into the school building to getting their meals. So there's a lot of great ideas out there, and we're anxious to get going with child nutrition reauthorization. And the last thing I just wanted to put out there before I go to your questions, oftentimes people will say, well, what can we do? We know the food banks out there. We know that there are some great advocates in Rhode Island that regularly speak with members of Congress and with the very impactful Rhode Island delegation. What can we do? And I think the role that you all play in being a resource to your elected officials and giving them information on the ground, what's happening, and the stories of clients that you see are incredibly rich and important. I will just tell you though, I think in this new Congress and with this new administration, I wouldn't just stop at your federal elected officials. I think there's going to be a greater emphasis on listening to the National Governors Association, the National Conference of State Legislatures, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the NACO, National Association of Counties. So up and down local government, I think elected officials will have a greater voice. And of course, your governor is a very strong voice in the NGA. And I wouldn't stop there. I would go to your mayors, I would go to your state legislators and make sure that they have the resources they need to go speak in their associations and help lift up the voices of the clients that you see on a regular basis. So I'm going to stop there and be happy to answer any questions or comments that you have.
Thank you, Ellen. That was terrific and really helps us to understand where things are right now as we're, in this lame duck period and what we can do, not just now, but, in the months to come. Clearly in Rhode Island, we were seeing tremendous help to families in need through SNAP, the increases in SNAP that came through the emergency and pandemic EBT. It was just such a necessary resource for families. And for us, there's just no question that the SNAP increases should go through, and they should absolutely go through in whatever the next pandemic relief bill is. So my question is, this economic downturn doesn't just affect Rhode Island, though it's affecting us pretty severely. It's affecting states across the whole country, every state. So, does that make it a better opportunity right now for us to try to get folks who might not usually support anti-hunger legislation to make it happen?
Great question. And the answer simply is yes. Every single state took advantage of the emergency allotments for SNAP. And what that did was allow every state to boost SNAP benefits up to the maximum level. Now, what happens is if you are at the maximum level, it's because you have exceedingly low income. So it didn't help 40% of families who are already at the max. And actually there were 2 lawsuits in California and Pennsylvania which challenged USDA's interpretation that if you were at the max, you couldn't get a benefit boost. So that is still in litigation right now. But we know that every state has taken advantage of that state option. We also know that every state has taken advantage of PEBT. Now, Andrew, does Rhode Island have summer EBT?
We do not. So, we would like to.
I know. So what we're very excited about, since PEBT was implemented in every state, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the territories, and so now it's up and running and the administrative structure is there, our ask is, why not have summer EBT just continue on into the future, so we know that if kids are not getting access to a summer site, at least we know, especially in rural and remote areas, they're getting access to a summer EBT card. So yes, coming out of this pandemic, some really great national sort of pilots have been running, and we're getting great data. And I know my colleagues at FRAC are putting together reports on what PEBT has done for positive health outcomes, for just, all different kinds of indicators to show that food insecurity went down in the families that received the PEBT benefits. So yes, we're very excited about that. We're also very excited to see a continuation and an expansion of a provision called community eligibility. And what that does is it targets schools in low-income areas rather than counting paper applications from every single household. We know that there are schools that are located in areas that are overwhelmingly families with low incomes. Let's provide meals to all the kids in those schools and let the school food service folks spend their time creating wonderful meals for the kids rather than chasing down paper applications. When we know that so many of those children are in SNAP or TANF families or homeless families, let's just take those statistics, apply it to the school, and let the school feed all kids. And especially we know from our research that when schools do universal breakfast programs, and they do it either after the bell or grab and go or breakfast in the classroom for everyone, it benefits all the children. And yes, your grandmother was right. When you eat a good breakfast, your test scores go up, you're less ornery, you're less likely to go to the nurse with belly aches, less disciplinary problems, less tardiness, less absenteeism. So it's been a phenomenal tool in an educator's toolbox to have breakfast in the classroom. So again, in a child nutrition reauthorization bill, so much what we've learned through this past 9 months of coronavirus, we'll definitely want to see implemented in a child nutrition reauthorization or in an economic recovery package coming down the pike.
That's great. Thank you. And in what you just said, Ellen, I think you point out another really important resource that FRAC provides to all of us, and that is research. And the reports that come out of FRAC, if anyone in our audience isn't familiar with it, go to frac.org, look at the reports they have, because their research completely backs up our advocacy and strengthens advocacy that we can do.
Well, it's a symbiotic relationship, because many times I have gone on visits with Andrew, or we've done visits jointly, and it's wonderful for Andrew to have FRAC and Feeding America as the national organizations, supporting efforts in Rhode Island. But for someone like me to be able to go into Jack Reed's office, and I was just on the phone with 2 staffers from Reed's office last week. They said to say hello. One handles Veterans Affairs, the other one handles child nutrition programs. And it's just so great for me to be able to talk to them, and they are so grounded in what's happening back home because of the great work that the advocates do in Rhode Island. So it's just this wonderful collaboration.
It is. And I think now is a perfect time for us to take some questions from the audience. I want to introduce Lisa Roth-Blackman, our Chief Philanthropy Officer, who's going to check out those questions and ask them.
All right, and we do have a few questions piling up here. So the first one is, do you see any prospect for the expansion of universal free school meals in the new CNR, which is, I believe, Childhood Nutrition Reauthorization, as you were talking about?
These are great questions. The easy answer is yes. And I think what's interesting is during the campaign, this is like a little bit inside baseball. There were conversations going on between the Biden campaign and the Sanders folks and a lot of other candidates who are running for president. Bernie Sanders has a universal school meals bill that he has introduced that we helped draft. And of course, that is always the goal. Now, if you start, and right now we virtually have universal school meals because all of those requirements for means testing and on-site, those have all been waived right now so that families could get benefits through PEBT and through meals being delivered via the bus stop or pickup or whatever. So we feel that right now we have universal meals, and so doing anything less than that would be going backwards. But going forward, if we were to need to do things a little bit more incrementally, there are two ways I see this going. And I think the Biden folks would like to start with a targeted approach to make sure children in areas where families have low incomes, let them get universal meals first. And I mentioned community eligibility. There is legislation in Congress to broaden that, to allow more families into that program, to allow more schools to offer universal. And by broadening that out, we would see the first geographic areas be areas with children with very low incomes. Now, the other way we can do that is by eliminating the reduced price meal category. Right now, there are kids who pay for their school meals. There are kids who are in a reduced price meal category, which is between 130 and 180% of poverty, reduced price meals, and then children who receive their meals free. And what we find is a lot of kids in that reduced price meal category come from working poor families. And so if we fed all children up to 185% of poverty, it would make it administratively easier to run the program. We would target the next tranche of kids who are in families in need, and it will pretty much eliminate lunch shaming, which I know you guys in Rhode Island were one of the first to sort of just, discover. And so those families that are now having to find that 40 cents per meal, per kid, and they find themselves in arrears, if they were being fed free, that wouldn't happen. And FRAC and Chobani have been working jointly on a wonderful collaborative to try to eliminate lunch shaming and eliminating the reduced price meal category, or expanding out community eligibility, or advocating for universal meals programs are definitely ways that we can get a twofer. We can feed kids, we can make it easier for people who administer the programs, and we can get rid of lunch shaming for good.
Great, thank you. We have another question here about what can small or local governments like cities, counties, and towns do to advocate for increased SNAP benefits? You touched on this a little, but maybe expand.
Yeah. All of your local governments, your municipalities, your counties, they all have representation in Washington, D.C. And so your governor has an office in Washington, D.C., and those, the staff of her staff are in regular communication with your elected officials. They also work through the NGA, the National Governors Association. So they have two different ways, either individually or through their national organization. And it goes for your state legislators, your mayors, your county commissioners. They all have visibility here in DC, but also back home. And they all talk to one another all the time. So very often your senators or your congressional members will be in direct consultation with your local elected officials, needing to get sort of, on the ground testimonials of what's happening. And it's so critically important because immediately when the pandemic hit, folks were communicating up to elected officials what was happening in hospitality, what was happening to restaurants, what was happening to service workers. I mean, that information got transmitted really, really quickly. And that is how Congress was able to be nimble and pass legislation quickly. So that stream of information is really important. The other thing that I wanted to stress is the media. In a nanosecond through social media, things start trending. And that is really important, but also the deeper dive through op-eds, editorials. Every single member of Congress, the first thing they do in the morning, they have staff who just comb through the local papers. You do not have to get pieces into the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, because the first papers your elected officials read are your state papers, your local papers. They know everybody's reading those. So again, any way you can lift up what's happening through your local papers and through social media, working with the food bank and the Feinstein Center and all the other great outlets in Rhode Island, you should be doing that.
Great, thank you. We have a question about SNAP. The SNAP benefit to local economies like stores and farms, et cetera, the multiplier is a powerful stat. Is there a total dollar number that you use to communicate that benefit to the economy on a national level?
Hard to say because the number of folks on SNAP changes. And right now, the rolls of people on SNAP is very high because, as you know, SNAP is what we call an entitlement program. So like Social Security, like Medicare, if you meet the eligibility criteria, you get the benefit. Unlike WIC, which is a discretionary program where Congress appropriates a certain amount of money and that's all they have. And if the need increases, Congress has to give WIC more money, which they have done recently. So the beauty of SNAP is as the need increases and we see participation increase, we have the funds to handle that. So really very, very important. So what we do know through economists across the board is that for every dollar, as I mentioned before, for every dollar the federal government puts in, somewhere between $1.50 and $1.85 is generated in local economies. And that's the statistic that everybody uses. And it's everyone from Mark Zandi from Moody's to Jared Bernstein from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. So in fact, I was just on a webinar on Monday with Jared, and he reiterated in that how important a robust stimulus package is, not only to helping people and families in need, but that jolt to the economy is exactly what is needed right now at this particular point in time. And FRAC is finding itself partnering with a whole host of people. And just recently, we've reached out to the US Chamber of Commerce because they too are advocating for a robust COVID relief bill, because they want to see restaurants, hospitality, the airlines, and workers. And they specifically mention all of those our folks in need.
Great. Here's a specific question. When you say broaden CEP, which I believe is community eligibility provision, do you mean reduce the threshold percentage? Maybe you can explain that a little bit.
Yes, I think for people who are in the weeds on CEP, you know that it's based on a percentage of people who come in through SNAP, TANF, and who are homeless. And then there's a multiplier. We would like to see the multiplier strengthened in order to increase the number of schools that come into CEP. So yes, it is changing the threshold for which schools would be able to come in by broadening that multiplier.
Great.
There are great fact sheets on CEP on the FRAC website, written by experts who know that stuff way better than me.
Terrific. Here's another one. What are some actions the Biden administration can take to combat hunger that don't require legislative changes through the Senate?
Okay, this gets back to my number one priority. The Biden administration has mentioned on day one, they are going to continue DACA. They are going to get us into the Paris Climate Accord. They are, I believe they mentioned public charge. And we would like to see on that list, suspend and terminate those 3 SNAP rules, that 2 of which are in the pipeline, 1 that has been enjoined. We would like to see them just completely terminate those 3. And that could happen on day 1 of a Biden administration. And that is exclusively an administrative action. There is no need for Congress to get involved.
Got it. Here's another question. I love this. Can you tell us what the mood is like in DC during this transition period?
I was telling Andrew and Lisa earlier, I was a legal poll watcher in Philadelphia on election day. And then I went from Philly to New York City and to visit family. And I was walking with my kids on Broadway when all of a sudden you literally heard the roar. And there was a jubilance in the streets of Manhattan and here in DC that was palpable. I think people are very excited to have access again to staff at USDA and to have more open communication, to engage on a whole nother level again. And I'm just factually, Andrew and I are part of a group called NARON. It's the Northeast Regional Anti-Hunger Coalition. And we would meet every so often in Boston. And in those meetings, we would sit around a conference table with the regional officials of USDA. And it would be the person who runs SNAP, the person who runs child nutrition programs, the person who runs the child care feeding programs. And you'd have people from New York up to Maine, advocates around that table talking about what barriers they perceive, what information needs to be shared better, best practices. It was a very rich and wonderful conversation. The Trump administration put a muzzle on the regions. And we were told, and this is all regions, I would go out to San Francisco and meet with the Western region. And we were told by regional officials that any questions we had to submit in advance. And they had to be vetted through headquarters in DC. And they read us the responses. And when we had follow-up questions, they said, I'm sorry, we have to take that back to Washington. And so it became ridiculous to meet with these people because it was embarrassing. So I think this new administration will just allow for greater engagement for advocates at all levels. And I think our voices will be heard. And I mentioned this before we started on the call. The transition teams of the Biden administration were released yesterday. And it's for everything: commerce, treasury, veterans affairs, agriculture, at Office of Management and Budget. You look at the people who are listed, and they are representatives of every single community in this country. There are people on the agriculture transition team that come from the sustainable ag movement, from unions, from climate groups. I mean, just an incredible diversity, not only of organizations, but of individuals. One of my board members runs the Indigenous Agriculture Center in Little Rock, and Janie is from a tribe. Janie was being pulled between interior and agriculture. They both wanted her. So it's just this, like the doors are open now, and we have this opportunity for engagement that I have not seen in the past 4 years. So if you can sort of sense my enthusiasm in my tone, that is just rippling throughout the country, not just in Washington, throughout the country.
That's great to hear that there's hope. A more specific question: any recommendations for Secretary of Agriculture? Not sure if you're going to go there, but I'll throw it out there.
Yes. So one thing I just thought about this, and then I'll answer the question. It is really important that the federal nutrition programs have bipartisan support. And despite my enthusiasm for a new administration, I look at the House, I look at the Senate, and in my almost 35 years of advocacy, if you said to me, what is the most important attribute that you can attach to nutrition programs, I would say what has served us so well over the decades is that we have bipartisan support. And other entities often ask us to speak at their conferences to say, how do you do that? How do you maintain bipartisan support for your programs? And I always say it's the fact that our elected officials are so well educated on the impact our programs have on the lives of their constituents. And that's where you guys come in. So just wanted to put it out there that the bipartisan support is really important, and it's something that we will always treasure and always keep it in front. I can tell you the list of names of people that have been rumored to be under consideration for Secretary of Agriculture. They include Heidi Heitkamp, the former senator from North Dakota, Marcia Fudge, who's a representative from Ohio, and she serves on both the Ag Committee and the Education Committee in the House, because the Education Committee is the committee with jurisdiction over those child nutrition programs that we've mentioned earlier. So, she's an African-American woman. She would be the first African-American woman to head up USDA should she get that position. Other names we've heard, Maine Representative Shelley Pingree, who is an organic farmer. Also Sherry Bustos, who's a representative from Illinois. I've heard Steve Bullock, the former governor from Montana. Janie Hipp, who I mentioned earlier, who's on our board, who's with the Indigenous Agricultural Center in Little Rock, are just some of the names that have been floated as potential secretaries of agriculture. We have worked with all of those folks. And what is exciting to me is all of them are grounded in the federal nutrition programs. And so that is a wonderful attribute.
Great. I'm going to ask Andrew, there you are, to come back on.
Hey, well, Ellen, this is so exciting. You know, it really feels like it's a new day, and, you know, we're ready for greater engagement. So thank you so much for being with us this morning and for helping us understand the big picture and helping us understand what we can do right now in the months to come. Thank you to everybody in our audience for joining us this morning and for your great questions. Thank you, Lisa, for making sure that everyone got answers to their questions. I really like the question about the mood in DC. Because, you know, now we feel that here. And we're ready to join with advocates across the country and with FRAC to do whatever is necessary to make sure that the programs that have been so effective in this pandemic are continued, and that we can continue to show folks on both sides of the aisle that these programs are absolutely essential.
And I absolutely concur. I think all of us have just gotten COVID fatigue, and now we see an opening and an opportunity, and I just see so much cross-fertilization with the education community, the health community. I mean, your dean at Brown at the medical school, I mean, every morning he's on TV. So I would not be surprised if he doesn't land the Surgeon General job or something. So I think there are amazing opportunities for folks in Rhode Island to get their voices heard. So thank you. And I hope that next time we can break bread in person and have a fabulous meal at the food bank and enjoy each other's company.
Thank you, Ellen. And thanks
Anytime.
everyone for joining us.